Jonathan Mercer always moved like a man who owned every step he took. He walked with a wide, steady stride that matched the heavy tread of the company he had built. His hands were thick from work and from signing contracts. He wore suits that fit the way a glove fit a hand, neat, confident, and made to be noticed. Evelyn Mercer moved differently. She was softer in speech and careful in her laughter. People called her kind. She gave money to the hospital wing and lent her name to the theater. She knew how to say just enough to make strangers feel better and how to stay quiet where noise would hurt. Their house sat on a high hill just outside the busier streets of Austin. It was not the biggest house anyone had seen, but it looked important. Stone walls, tall windows, and a road lined with old live oaks led to a long drive. The garden showed money and taste, clipped hedges, a fountain that sang, lanterns that came on at night. Inside, the room smelled faintly of lemon oil and old books. The house had a piano in the front room, a long table for dinners, and a small study where Jonathan kept papers and plans. People in town knew the house. They watched lights go out late and sometimes saw the Mercers' car parked by the curb. They noticed them without always saying their names. On the afternoon of October 12, 1998, the Mercers prepared for a small dinner. Friends and some business guests were invited, people who liked the company and the food and who liked being seen in the right rooms. The table was set with folded napkins and silver that caught the lamplight. Evelyn wore a dress that moved like water when she walked. Jonathan told a story about a new building project and made a joke that made a few people laugh. Someone played a violin softly as the third course was served. Everything looked like the kind of night that would be remembered as pleasant, polite faces, good wine, careful talk. They left the table later than most. They crossed the room together and went from lamplight to softer places in the house. Friends talked for a while and then left. The staff cleared plates and folded napkins. The house settled. A neighbor taking his dog for its evening walk saw the Mercers drive down the lane in their car. He watched the headlights pass under the oak branches and then go dark. He did not think much of it. He thought they had gone out. He walked his dog home and later slept, like the town did, full of small certainties. In the morning, the housekeeper, Mara Sanchez, arrived early as she always did. Mara had worked at the Mercer house for 15 years. She knew the way Evelyn liked the living room curtains pushed back to let in the sun. She knew that Jonathan drank his coffee without sugar. She knew the sound of the family's laugh from the second-floor hallway. That morning, Mara knocked on the back door and waited. No answer. She had a spare key because that was part of her life. She cooked, she cleaned, and she cared for rooms that were not hers. She let herself in. The house was quiet in a way that felt wrong to Mara. 2 coffee cups sat on the kitchen counter. A newspaper lay still on the front step. In the bedroom, wardrobes were closed and clothes carefully folded. Their wallets and passports were in the bedroom drawer where people kept small things. The couple's keys were in a wooden bowl by the front door, the kind of small, tidy habit that felt like a signature. A leather overnight bag lay open on a guest bed. Someone had moved a folder from inside it, but otherwise nothing had been taken. Nothing seemed broken, nothing torn. Yet the Mercers were not there. Police came quickly because the absence of people who should be home called attention. At first the officers thought the couple might have left without telling the staff. People sometimes left like that, sudden trips, private family matters. But then they checked more carefully. The security system had been turned off in the middle of the night. The log showed the system deactivated at 2:13 a.m. The master code had been used. No sign of forced entry was found anywhere on doors or windows. The master safe in Jonathan's study had been closed and showed no sign of being opened. Nothing suggested a fight or a loud struggle. The house did not smell of panic. It smelled of the ordinary: lemon oil, the faint ash of a recently burnt candle, and the soft thread of last night's perfume. Detectives began to ask simple, sharp questions. Where had Jonathan and Evelyn gone? Who had the master code? Who had entered the house late at night? The staff answered carefully. Mara said she had locked the back gate around midnight. She said she had gone to her small room and slept. She shared that the couple had been a little quieter that week. Evelyn had asked a question one morning, the kind of quick worry no one else had heard, about whether they were safe. Mara said the tone in Evelyn's voice had been different, thin with a worry Mara had not seen before. Neighbors offered small details that became large ones when examined. One neighbor remembered seeing a young man in a pickup truck parked near the bottom of the Mercer's drive late at night. He waved and then left. The truck's registration did not immediately match anyone connected to the household. Another neighbor said she thought she heard the Mercer's car start and then stop in the night, but she had not gone outside. Small things like those began to look like the threads of a net. The police asked family and friends if the Mercers had plans to leave. Their son, Oliver, lived in New York and called his parents' home often. He could not reach them. He called friends, lawyers, former colleagues. He asked if they had traveled on long trips recently, if they had a secret flight plan, or if they had plans to start over. No one had heard from them. A private investigator was hired by the family and went through old contracts and new deals. Banks checked the accounts and paused transactions while they looked for strange activity. Lawyers combed through Jonathan's work files for clues. People in the town began to whisper. Where people had once admired the Mercers for their parties and gifts, they now turned the story into questions about power, money, and enemies created by deals done with speed. Detective Marco Ruiz led the investigation. Ruiz had been on the force for 20 years. He had a steady way of seeing what others glanced past. He walked through the room slowly, watching how light touched the piano keys, how shadows filled the corners. He sat where the Mercers had sat at their dinner table and listened to the quiet. He spoke to Mara gently, listening to her memories as if the right question might make the missing people appear. He found himself thinking about a photograph Mara found hidden in a book in the library. The photograph had been carefully placed, like a secret put away for a rainy day. It showed Jonathan and Evelyn smiling by a long road under bright sun. But someone had cut out a figure from the photograph. The paper where this person should have been was jagged and soft. Someone had removed a presence from the image. Ruiz took the photograph and held it as if the missing piece might be a map. For him, it was not only an image but a language of something people tried to hide. He wrote careful notes, the time the alarm went off, the spare key locations, the names of those with access to the master code. He recorded the neighbor's truck sighting, the open overnight bag, and the untouched safe. He logged every detail with steady fingers. He knew a missing persons case grew colder each day. He knew the list of things to do was long and there were no guarantees. He kept asking small questions to people who knew small things. In the week that followed, the house drew more than detectives. TV vans arrived at the gate. Reporters knocked at the door with paper in their hands and questions in their faces. People who had once admired the Mercers now sat on their couches and stared at television screens that showed the house's stone walls and a driveway flanked by live oaks. Rumors moved through town like wind through the trees. Did the Mercers leave to escape a scandal? Had someone come to take them? Had a stranger or a lover or an enemy slipped them away? Each rumor grew louder in the quiet spaces of the night. Yet the facts in the house remained simple and stubborn. 2 coffee cups. A newspaper. Wallets and passports in a drawer. A master code used at 2:13 a.m. A photograph with a missing figure. And in a small stack of papers, a wooden bowl with car keys. The house felt like a life held still, a pause button pressed in the middle of a sentence. For those who loved the Mercers, the pause felt like a wound that would not close. For Detective Ruiz, it felt like a question that would not go away until someone offered a confident answer. He did not yet know which kind of answer it would be, an explanation that opened the page to a new story, or a truth that kept people waiting for the ending that might never come. Cold cases have a way of changing the people who hold them. They rest in file cabinets and in the backs of minds. They thicken the air around rooms and make ordinary things feel important. For the Mercer case, the first months of searching gave way to years of small efforts and quiet waiting. The heat of the headlines cooled. The TV vans left. But the questions did not leave the house, the town, or the people who had loved Jonathan and Evelyn. Oliver Mercer could not let go. He moved between New York and Austin for a time, trying to keep a life where some part of him still believed he could open a door and find his parents there. He sat in the empty study and held paper the way a man holds memories. He read through contracts and old letters, looking for motives or a mistake he could undo. He hired private investigators who promised to follow every small lead. He paid for records, for searches, for the kind of attention that makes people answer questions they would otherwise ignore. Oliver was not certain whether the answer would make him feel better or worse. He only knew he could not sit with nothing. Private investigators came and went. Some were careful and kind. Some left after promising things they never delivered. One investigator, a woman named Clara Jensen, spent weeks tracing bank records and phone calls. She found months where Jonathan had made last-minute transfers to accounts that later emptied. The transfers were small and not flagged as illegal. They looked like the kind of movement a cautious person might make when he felt pressure closing in. Clara believed the transfers pointed to a plan, not a panic. She kept notes and a thin folder she gave Oliver, saying, "Sometimes paper speaks when people do not." Detective Marco Ruiz did not stop either. He aged in the way men who worry do, more slowly than life itself, with a steady thread of determination. He kept the photograph Mara had found in the library. He kept a list of names and a notebook full of observations. Ruiz had always trusted small facts. He believed that a neighbor's memory, a ledger entry, or a truck license plate could be the hinge a case needed. He checked in with Oliver. He wrote letters to himself in which he reminded himself to keep looking. He also watched how the case cost people time and sleep. He watched Mara change jobs and move away because the house had become too full of ghosts. He watched Luis Ortega become quieter and smaller, as if the years had been a slow folding. Luis had been a person who kept the house. He took care of the garden, paid attention to the wine, and knew where things were hidden. In the early interviews he had given to police, Luis had seemed loyal and sad. He had told the detectives small things that sounded useless then but grew larger with time, the crate in the workshop, a delivery that arrived late in September, and how he had once been given a small envelope and told to forget the matter. Luis's memory had holes. He was not a man who kept ledgers or receipts. He kept feelings. That made him hard to pin down. It made him hard to trust, even as Oliver and others wished he would simply speak plainly. Rumors traveled in a town like Austin in the years after the disappearance. People built stories out of what they did not know. Some said the Mercers had been forced to flee because of a scandal in Jonathan's business. Others said the couple had been so clever they had simply left and started over with new names in a place where no one would find them. Children heard stories at school and repeated them with the certainty of imagination. Barbers and diners turned the tale into a lesson about money and about how quickly life could change when people wanted something badly. There were also names that stuck to the case like burrs on cloth. Garrett Hale's name came up often. He was a development man who had fought with Jonathan in court over land. He had the sort of charm that opened doors and the sort of enemies that made people whisper. In the early days, Garrett had denied involvement in anything that would harm the Mercers. He filed counterclaims and sent lawyers letters. But he did not disappear from the edges of the investigations. He showed up in depositions and in business records. People watched how lines of money moved through shells and accounts that were harder to trace. Those lines of money made the simple idea of a land dispute look like a net tied around people with power. Then there was Connor Blake. Connor was the kind of man whose memory bent with the wind. He had small crimes in his past and an interest in bargaining with the law for a lighter sentence. Connor told detectives he had acted as a mover after the Mercers vanished. He described a pickup and an anonymous man who paid cash and asked him to make things disappear. At first his testimony seemed like a loose string. Later, as the years wore on, his statements shifted again and again until detectives could not rely on them. Connor's words were a reminder that not all witnesses hold the truth steady. Some hold a version of truth they shape for themselves. Detectives filed him under possible help, probable error. The case taught people the difference between how a community remembers and how evidence works. Memory is messy. It carries bias and emotion. Evidence is cold. It needs handling and context. The two often stood apart like strangers at a market. For every neighbor who remembered a truck, there were paper trails that did not exist. For every friendly business partner who came forward with a memory, there were lawyers producing documents that denied wrongdoing. The search for answers was not only about finding a person or a place, it was about teaching the town to test its own stories. In the years that followed, Samira Patel began to stand out. She was a local reporter who had turned from covering city councils to following the small corruption stories others ignored. Samira had been young when the Mercers vanished, but she felt the story in her bones. She believed that power hides in plain sight when people fail to ask enough questions. Samira dug into old press boxes and found scraps of paper that others had dismissed. One of those scraps was a ledger. It was thin and messy and it said little at first, a note reading Desert 31 with initials beside it. Samira thought the ledger could be a scrap left by someone who had packed hastily. She put it in a drawer, not sure then what it meant. She kept watching. Time changed relationships. Oliver found friends who would stand with him and enemies who wished his family gone. Business deals that had once seemed straightforward became evidence of pressure and temptation. Lawsuits dripped down the years like slow rain. The Mercer Company lost contracts and the family's holdings shrank under waves of legal fights. Evelyn's charity work lost momentum as board members slipped away or argued about how the Mercer name should be used. The social life that had once been full of laughter and light narrowed to quieter meetings and more careful dinners. But cold cases have moments when a small detail returns like a lost key. Detective Ruiz kept his red folder. He wrote names and dates in that folder and reread pages when he felt the case cooling. He sat with his old partners and reminded them of the photograph with the missing figure. He reminded them of the master code used at 2:13 a.m. He did not have proof of what had happened. He did have a trail of facts that did not sit right together. Those facts made for restless nights. They made for a man who kept checking the list, again and again, the same way someone checks that a door is locked. Oliver, too, practiced a kind of ritual. He drove by the house sometimes and saw new people living in rooms he had known. He touched the gate as if to test whether it would open or close for him. He collected letters from friends and folded them into a box he never opened. He started to meet with others who had family members missing. He joined a group that helped people who could not let go. In helping them, he found an odd comfort. He learned that loss could become work if he let it. He taught a course at a small community college about how to read public records and how to keep track of a story that time tried to erase. Years became a pattern. The courthouse saw papers filed and then withdrawn. Bank record checks came back with dead ends and then with new leads that ended in the same way. The town of Austin moved on with new buildings, new politics, and new names attached to parks and roads. People still remembered the Mercers, but their memory softened into a story told at neighborhood barbecues, the rise and fall of a family, the danger of making enemies in business, the weight of money. Then, as the years turned toward 27, the case hung like a picture not yet hung on the wall. People passed by and glanced. They felt the itch. The red folder sat in Ruiz's cabinet and the ledger sat in Samira's drawer. Oliver kept paying investigators and kept pressing for small checks that others found tiresome. He believed that if he kept looking, something would change. He believed that mistakes often become visible decades later because people who made them either die or grow tired of keeping secrets. Detective Ruiz sometimes went to sleep thinking that the right clue could come from anywhere: a rusted box, an old receipt, or the memory of a driver who never thought his small action mattered. He did not know when or where that clue would appear. He only knew that until it did, he would hold the folder like a map, and he would keep looking at the photograph with the cut figure. He did not let the case rest in his mind because someone deserved to know. For him, work and mercy had tangled into the same thing. And so the search continued, quiet, patient, and stubborn. The town carried on. People aged. Contracts closed. Gardens grew. Yet in the drawer of an old reporter and in the rustle of a retired detective's papers, the Mercer story waited for the small, ordinary thing that might make it a case again. The boy's name was Mateo, and he liked walking with his dog because the dog found things people missed. That afternoon in early spring, the sky was pale and wide, and the ground smelled of dry grass and old rain. Mateo followed a dirt track out past a closed gate and into a flat place where the land rose and fell like someone had smoothed it with a great, slow hand. The dog ran in circles, nose low, and then began to scratch at a place near a thorny bush. Mateo walked over and used the butt of his shoe to scrape sand away. He saw metal under the dirt and edge with rust. He dug with his hands until his fingers were raw and the lid came loose with a long, thin moan. Inside the box were things that looked like pieces of someone's life, not things a thief would take if they meant to vanish cleanly. There was a small leather journal with a torn corner and a jumble of notes inside. There were Polaroid pictures, yellowed at the edges and tied with a rubber band. A voice recorder lay in the box like a small black stone, dust still in its seams. Wrapped in cloth was a brass key, tarnished but heavy. There were 2 passports with worn covers and stamps that suggested trips long ago. Mateo did not know what the items meant, but he knew they should not be sitting under a lonely bush in the wind. He put the lid back and ran with the box to the ranger's office 3 miles away. At the ranger's office, the woman at the desk looked at the box and her face went grave in a way that asked Mateo to be quiet. She called the sheriff, and the sheriff called the county detective. By the time the evidence tech arrived, the box was being treated like something very fragile. Photographs were taken before anything was touched. Each item was catalogued with a small white tag and placed into paper bags so fingerprints could be saved. When the voice recorder's battery hummed faintly as the tech switched it on, the sound made everyone still. There was a thin click and then a man's voice, low and hurried, Desert 31. Bring the ledger. Stay away from the house. Tell no one. If anything happens, the map is in the crate. Remember the code, 942. The voice ended with the sound of a breath and the recorder clicked off. News of the find moved through channels with the quickness of a rumor. Doing a small thing turned into a river of actions. The county called the FBI because the case involved missing people from years before, and the missing people were not ordinary. The Mercers were known in Austin. Detective Marco Ruiz heard the news from a friend on the force and felt a hollow twist in his chest like a lock turning. He had kept his old folder for years, a careful red file that smelled faintly of tobacco and coffee stains. He drove to the ranger's office without the thought of delay. When he arrived and saw the Polaroids spread on a table, his fingers trembled in a way he always hid from the cameras. The Polaroids were small squares of sun and people. One showed Jonathan Mercer with his arm around a man Detective Ruiz recognized as Garrett Hale in an earlier year. In another, Evelyn smiled with a paper in her hand that looked folded into a small secret. One Polaroid, taped on the back, had a note in Evelyn's handwriting, "If it gets worse, use them." A third photo showed a younger Luis Ortega, the estate manager, standing under a tree with a pipe in his mouth. The pieces fit like parts of a word that had been split apart. Samira Patel came to the ranger's office the day the box was logged. She smelled like paper and old coffee, and she had a stack of notes folded into her jacket. Years earlier she had found a battered ledger that mentioned Desert 31 and had tucked it into a drawer while she considered what to do. She had kept the ledger because sometimes the past keeps trying to speak. Seeing the same phrase on the recorder made her hands shake. She sat with the Polaroids and matched them with names in her old notes until the names and faces lined up like a map. The passports were strange. They bore names that matched Jonathan and Evelyn but with slightly different birth years and travel stamps that suggested crossings into Mexico and back. Somebody had planned for movement across borders or at least had an idea of how to make movement possible. The leather journal was the most intimate thing. Its pages were a mixture of quick, angry handwriting and slow letters that looked like Evelyn had written them at night by a small light. There were lists, names with numbers beside them, maps with X's drawn and erased, the shorthand of someone who planned and hid things. In one page, Jonathan had written, "If they come, do not answer. Pack only the small things. Leave the letters in the crate." In another, Evelyn had written, "Luis knows. I trust Luis, but he is afraid. If anything, bury these where no one will look." Detectives treated each line and each photograph as if a hidden key could be read the wrong way if they rushed. The voice on the recorder named a code 942 and mentioned a ledger. The ledger Samira had found years ago now fit into the story like a lost sentence. The people who had kept parts of the truth had scattered their evidence like crumbs, careful to leave something no one would expect. The desert, where people often thought nothing important ever happened, had become the place where someone had hidden the most telling pieces. When detectives went to interview Luis, he opened his door slowly, like a man who had been asked to stand in the light after many years in shadow. He had aged. His hands trembled and his eyes were wet in a way that made him look smaller than before. He told them things that came out like a confession slowed down and forced through a sieve. He said he had been loyal to the Mercers but that in the weeks before they vanished he had seen fear in Jonathan's face. He said he had helped carry a heavy crate into the workshop when a delivery arrived, he had seen maps and papers, and he had been told to keep them safe. He said that later men had come and offered him money to be quiet. "I was afraid," he said. "I thought if I kept it hidden, I would protect them." He choked on the words and reached for a chair. Luis's voice was full of regret and small details that mattered. He described a man who had come to the house with an even smaller man in his shadow. He described being handed small envelopes with cash that had no names. He told of nights when he lay awake and heard the Mercers talk in the next room and then decide together to do something secret, something that seemed sensible at the time and terrible later. He said that after the couple vanished he could not sleep. He said he took a few of the photographs and some papers and buried them because he hoped someone would one day find them and then he would be spared the weight of having kept a secret. He signed the note the detectives found. "I could not carry it any more. Because he could no longer hold the grief inside." The evidence techs worked slowly. They lifted fingerprints from the journal and the passports. They scanned the Polaroids and compared faces with old police photos. They looked for paper fibers, traces of soil, and the angle of the rust on the box to estimate how long it had stayed under the bush. The voice recorder's clarity was poor but enough to give the officers leads. Forensic accountants, older now and kinder for the wrinkles of time, sat with Samira and Detective Ruiz and traced payments from old bank reports. The money moved in ways that suggested careful hiding, transfers through short-lived accounts, names that were initials rather than full names, and a string of withdrawals that led to an address tied to a man with connections to the development world. The discovery in the desert made the case move from a story kept in drawers to a story that had to be answered. It brought reporters and old friends back to the town, and it drew families to the courthouse steps in the late light. For Oliver, the Mercer's son, the cash was a kind of answer he had not expected but that he had always hoped for, proof that his parents had not simply vanished into a new life without a trace. He felt a small, strange relief at the idea that someone had hidden their things and that someone else had found them. but relief was small next to a greater ache. Each new piece of evidence opened doors to paths where a final truth might still hide. Even with the box found and Luis telling what he knew, the detectives understood that evidence does not speak in full sentences. It offers fragments and asks detectives to make a reasonable picture. The map had more blanks than marks. Who had arrived at the house that night? Why had the security been turned off with the master code? Had the Mercers left willingly and then been stopped on the road? Had someone planned to make them disappear until papers could be rewritten? The desert box promised something important, but it also reminded everyone that time had smoothed over memories and that some people who knew things had died or moved away. Still, discovery changes the shape of things. It allows questions to be sharper. It lets detectives subpoena bank records with more authority and asks witnesses to remember details with more weight. It asks the public to look not only at rumors but at careful, patient work. For a case that had lived for 27 years in the soft gray of unsolved, the found crate stuck into the earth like a bolt of light. It did not answer everything. It did not bring back the Mercers. It did something else. It moved the story from a shelf to a table where people could look at it, touch it, and finally try to read what the past had left them. Detectives felt the case change the moment the desert box hit the news. What had been a private sorrow turned into public work. People who once shrugged now read headlines. Men who had kept their distance put on suits and made statements. The town's small power centers shifted like sand under a slow tide. For Detective Marco Ruiz, the change meant long days and longer nights, but it also gave him the tools he needed, permission to ask sharper questions and the legal backing to follow a paper trail that years before had been politely ignored. The first target was proof of movement, money and men. Prosecutors and forensic accountants sat with the ledger Samira had kept and the new documents from the desert. They traced payments that led through short-lived bank accounts and ended in cash withdrawals and anonymous envelopes. The transfers had once looked like tidy bookkeeping. Now, with the ledger and the passports beside them, each small payment looked more like a step in a plan. Names that had been initials on paper began to take faces from old photographs. The people whose names breathed on the pages were not all small men. Some had grown into positions of power. Some had political friends who moved quickly to protect their interests. Garrett Hale, the developer whose name kept appearing in court filings and private suits, spoke calmly on camera and denied any wrongdoing. He said he had been involved in business disputes with Jonathan but had never ordered anyone to hurt or move the Mercers. His lawyers sent letters demanding retractions and promised a fight. Thomas Kendrick, a bank official named in the ledger, declared the transfers routine and insisted the records showed nothing illegal. Both men had reputations built over decades, and both had teams of lawyers ready to challenge evidence in court. The legal push and the men's wealth did not stop the investigators. Instead, it made them more careful. Subpoenas went out. Bank records that had been hard to access in past years were produced under federal orders. Small men who had once moved boxes and dropped envelopes in plain lots found quiet summonses on their kitchen tables. Some came willingly to talk. Others called lawyers and shut the door. Elias Boone was the kind of man the investigators wanted to reach. He had been a fixer, a man who knew how to move things without questions. He had been arrested on an unrelated fraud charge and now sat in a federal holding cell where bargains were possible. Elias agreed to speak in exchange for leniency. His voice, when it came, was flat and pragmatic. He named names he had once been paid to avoid naming. He described nights when he had driven trailers, when boxes had moved from people's hands into storage, and when men with clipped accents had paid cash to silence a cleaner or a driver. He said those orders had come from a man who worked for a development team and that the payment threads led back to accounts with the same numbers in the ledger from the desert box. Elias's testimony did something the papers could not. It connected small acts into a single plan. Where once the town had a list of odd events, crates in a workshop, a truck at the bottom of a drive, a master code used at night. Now prosecutors could argue these strange things were steps in a deliberate effort to keep the Mercers from speaking. Elias said the plan was not to kill but to remove them and to buy time while documents and deeds were quietly rewritten. He said the men had been told the Mercers would reappear once the money and signatures were in place. He used the word move more than the word harm, but the idea that people had been hidden against their will sent a chill through courtrooms and living rooms. Not everyone believed Elias at once. His life was a pattern of bargains, and bargains have small costs in credibility. Defense lawyers painted him as a man who would say anything to get a break. The prosecutors acknowledged his faults but pointed to his detailed knowledge of routes and receipts that only someone who had been there could know. Little paper clues, gas receipts, motel ledgers, a faded map with a route drawn in pencil matched his recollection. Those details made his testimony more than words, they became proof. At the same time, a soft voice from a nursing home changed the tone of the search. An elderly woman called the sheriff after seeing a news segment about the cache. She had once worked at a roadside motel on a back highway and remembered two guests who had asked for a quiet room in October 1998. She said a man had paid cash and asked for no receipt. He had looked nervous but said little. She had driven them to the bus station herself because the motel was off a road and the driver wanted to be gone early. The woman's memory was not perfect, years had smudged details, but she remembered the couple's posture and the way the man helped the woman into the car. Her testimony was small and human. It gave detectives a new path: a bus ticket, a motel ledger with a faint signature, a bus driver who remembered carrying 2 suitcases and 2 tired people onto a night bus. The motel ledger and the bus driver's recollection were not ironclad, but they were enough to push investigators to keep looking beyond the city limits. As subpoenas reached banks and construction companies, men who had once felt secure began to feel the heat. Garrett Hale's empire had flourished partly because people trusted his name. Now that trust cracked in public view. Contracts were examined. Property titles were pulled from long files and scanned. The documents that once closed deals were now evidence for a story that would go to court. Forensic accountants found transfers that matched the ledger entries labeled Desert. The money trail showed how anonymous shell accounts had moved cash to men who later moved boxes. Small envelopes with numbers corresponded to the ledger's odd shorthand. But the path to the truth was not simple. Powerful people fought subpoenas, citing business privacy and shaky memories from decades ago. Witnesses who might have spoken bolted at the sight of legal threats or quietly changed their stories. Threats, quiet and ugly, circulated. Some witnesses received envelopes with no return address and felt old loyalties press them into silence. Others refused to speak out of fear. For Oliver, who now sat through hearing after hearing, the sense that power could still intimidate people felt like salt in an old wound. He watched as people who had once been friendly and open closed themselves with polite distance. Yet some people did speak. A low-level contractor stepped forward and told a jury about loading boxes into a storage unit and driving them to a place he later could not name. A bank clerk, who had kept a ledger of checks, quietly handed over a photocopy of a signature that matched one of the names on the Mercer Journal. Small confessions collected into a mosaic that told a picture clearer than any one person's memory. Public feeling split. Some townsfolk wanted harsh punishment, others worried about the consequences of ruining reputations without absolute proof. On the courthouse steps, news cameras captured arguments and prayers. Samira wrote articles that methodically laid out the paper trail. She focused on facts and avoided the sensational. Her reporting helped the public understand the ledger's pattern, the desert entry, a set of payments, and men who profited from silence. The legal battle stretched on, but prosecutors won enough to charge a handful of men with conspiracy and obstruction. Those charged were not the empire's highest towers but the men with hands on the boxes and in the garages, men who had moved papers and paid hush money. In their trials, juries heard the ledger, Elias's testimony, the motel woman's memory, and the bus driver's account. Lawyers for the defense pushed back hard, arguing the story was a tangle of imagination and motive. But juries found the details: gas receipts, short-lived bank transfers, and photographic evidence hard to dismiss. In the quieter hours, Detective Ruiz would walk the courthouse steps and feel the old ache of cases he had closed imperfectly. He thought of the photograph with a cut figure and of Mara sweeping the kitchen where 2 cups sat untouched. He thought of how small acts burying a box, paying a man with cash had built into something that could vanish 2 lives. He felt a tired relief when juries found men guilty of moving papers and of trying to obstruct truth, but he also felt the ache of what the verdicts did not touch, whether the Mercers were alive or dead. Oliver watched the legal fight from a different angle. He wanted a clear ending, but he understood that law moves slowly. He read journal pages aloud to himself and thought of his parents making plans in whispers. He met with Samira and with prosecutors, and he attended hearings without speaking much. In private, he kept hope and grief together like 2 small birds in one hand, rare and fragile. He found small satisfaction in seeing men who had once been hidden by money now named in court. He found a strange peace in action, as if moving the paperwork forward eased a part of his pain. As Part 4 closed in the years-long story, the town had changed in ways both public and private. Men had been convicted for parts of the plan, other men fought and waited. New policies tightened around land sales and bank oversight. A few quiet men who had once paid to keep others silent now faced the consequences of their actions. The Desert Crate had done what time could not: it had turned rumor into evidence, and small, ordinary facts into a mosaic that a jury could understand. Still, the biggest question remained: where were Jonathan and Evelyn Mercer? The box in the sand had not answered that. It had opened doors, exposed ledgers, and sent men to trial. It had not returned the couple to a son's arms. For Detective Ruiz, for Oliver, and for the few who loved the Mercers, the case had become a long, complicated truth. Justice could be partial, it could punish some things and leave other things unclosed. The work would continue. The next steps would be to follow the bus trail and the motel receipts deeper, and to listen for the one small witness whose memory could finish the story. The courtroom was full on the day the first verdicts came in. People who had watched the story for years sat close and leaned forward like they wanted to catch every sound. Reporters filled the back rows and typed into small machines. Oliver sat with his hands folded. He read nothing and said less. The papers Samira had kept were spread on a table. Detective Ruiz watched with a hollow relief that felt part victory and part sorrow. The men who had handled boxes and driven trailers were the first to face a jury. They were not the wealthy men whose names had been whispered for years. They were the ones with rough hands and tired expressions who had once received envelopes and followed orders. Their crimes, as the trial showed, were not simply small errors. The men had been part of a plan that used money and secrecy to hide papers and hide people. Jurors looked at photographs, heard about payments traced through short-lived accounts, and listened to testimony from a fixer who had finally chosen to speak. The jury believed the pattern. They found several of the men guilty of conspiracy and obstruction. When the verdicts were read, some people in the courtroom sighed loudly and let their shoulders drop as if a weight had been lifted. Others cried softly. For Oliver, the moment was confusing. The guilty verdicts gave him evidence that his parents had been targeted. They also made him feel the absence of an ending even more sharply. He had hoped the trials would bring both truth and closure. Instead, they brought truth in part and a new set of questions. The trials did not end with every name on the lists. Garrett Hale and Thomas Kendrick, men whose initials and transfers appeared in ledgers, fought the charges with lawyers and with money that made the law move slowly. Kendrick's bank record irregularities were examined in public. Garrett's empire was probed in court papers and under harsh questions from investigators. In the end, prosecutors could not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the 2 men had ordered the disappearance of the Mercers. They had, however, shown a pattern of pressure and obfuscation that led to sanctions, fines, and changes in business oversight. The high men kept their freedom. They paid fines and surrendered some contracts. The lower men went to prison for years. The town watched and felt both vindicated and cheated. Elias Boone's deal with prosecutors helped put names to actions. He gave long, specific statements about how boxes were moved and who paid for silence. In return for his help, investigators pushed for leniency. Elias's life became a public trade. A man who once helped hide truth now told much of it to buy a smaller sentence. Some people in town scorned him for the bargain. Others felt gratitude that his words finally made parts of the story clear. Elias lived with both the shame and the small relief of a man who had chosen to speak. Luis Ortega's confession was the most complicated thing for the family. He had buried photographs and papers because he had been afraid. He had written the note found in the desert, "I could not carry it anymore," the line that finally led to the metal box that Mateo had found. At the trial, Luis sat with his head bowed. He spoke in a voice that cracked and begged for forgiveness. He described the nights when he watched the Mercers talk by lamplight and when he accepted small envelopes to stay quiet. He said he had never seen the couple again after that night in 1998. Some in the courtroom called him a coward. Others quietly said his confession had been brave. Oliver chose to speak softly to Luis after the hearing. He said nothing about blame. He said he wanted to know why and wanted to understand. Luis cried, and his tears were slow and real. Even with court records and witness testimony, the Mercers' fate stayed unknown. The bus trail that had once seemed promising gave detectives pieces but not proof. A motel ledger entry matched the description of the couple who had left with cash paid at a roadside motel, and a bus driver remembered carrying two people who looked tired and frightened. But the trail stopped where the bus crossed state lines. Records from that time were incomplete and, in some places, gone. People move in many ways when they want to disappear. Some start a new life with new names. Others meet violence on the road. The detectives found no body and no last address. Oliver refused to give himself to endless speculation. He had learned what grief could do when it lived alongside hope. He chose action. He used some of the settlement money and donations that came in after the news stories to start a small foundation in his parents' names. The foundation aimed to protect lands the Mercers had loved and to help families who had missing relatives. He wanted something that would honor the part of his parents he believed still existed, a love for land and for small, careful things. Samira joined him. She helped organize documents and taught a class on how to keep records and follow a paper trail. The foundation gave grants to local conservation groups and to legal clinics that help families of missing people seek answers. The city responded in small but practical ways. Banks tightened oversight for unusual transfers. Local land sale rules were changed to make it harder to buy fragile land through shell accounts. The county set up a small team that helped families with missing relatives learn how to gather records, what questions to ask, and how to work with investigators without getting lost in legalese. These changes were not dramatic. They were small fixes in a system that had once let secrets slide. People called these reforms a measure of justice. They said the city would be harder to cheat in the future. Detective Ruiz retired soon after the main trials ended. He walked out of the courthouse with a folder under his arm and a soft smile that did not reach his eyes. He had pushed a case for decades. He had watched people change and watched the law move slowly. He felt pride for the men who had been convicted, even as he carried a private sorrow for the unanswered questions. He spent mornings in his small garden and afternoons reading newspapers, but sometimes he drove to the old Mercer gate and sat in his car and looked at a photograph he kept folded in his pocket, the one with the missing figure. He could not let go of that image. And he did not want to. Luis tried to live a small life after the trials. He volunteered some hours at the foundation and tried to make amends in quiet ways. He walked to the garden in the afternoons and planted a sapling. He visited the nursing home where an elderly motel worker had once lived and thanked her for the small memory that had opened a new path. His apologies did not erase the past. They were a small attempt to fix what had been broken. The desert crate was catalogued and stored in a federal evidence room. Scientists and archivists photographed the leather, counted the Polaroids, and protected the pages of the journal. The box itself sat on a low shelf where only a few people could see it. For scholars who study how gossip becomes law, the box became a teaching object. For families who lost people, it became a reminder that sometimes a small act, a dog's digging, a teenager's curiosity, can change a case that once seemed frozen. On the first anniversary of the verdicts, Oliver stood by the Mercer gate and placed roses in front of two small photographs. He read the last lines of his parents' journal aloud in a voice that trembled but did not break. He spoke of the land they had loved and of the small acts that had finally made truth visible. He did not say he had closure. He did not say he knew whether his parents had lived long after they left the house or whether they had been harmed on a lonely road. He said he had enough truth now to fight for the things his parents had cared about. He said he would keep looking. That is what the story left behind, not an ending but a new work. The town had changed. Men had gone to prison. Rules had been tightened. A foundation had been born. And still, at night, when the wind moved through the live oaks by the old gate, people sometimes imagined two lights moving down a long road, one of hope, one of fear, and they thought of how the smallest moments can hold the largest secrets.